Hey designers, welcome back to the studio. We're going to wrap up our drawing unit now with a study in value again, but this study is going to be with color. And so if you remember our basic color theory lecture, you might remember the term monochromatic gradation. Well, a monochrome gradation is very similar to the gradations that we've already worked up, moving from dark to light. Except at this time, instead of using sort of simple black and white value studies, we're going to use basic watercolor kit and probably one of the darker hues or darker pigments in our kit here to render out a value study right on our value study sheet. But instead of working directly in our sketchbook, let's work with some of the nicer watercolor paper that we've got in here. So find the extra sheets of watercolor paper that I sent with you. Now, it's a very particular type of watercolor paper I gave you. This is Reeves BFK, so it's not actually a watercolor paper. It's a sort of a wet media paper or printmaker's paper. And if you sort of carefully hold your paper up to the light, you may find the Reeves watermark in the corner. You may want to avoid that with some of your drawings or paintings. For me, this piece of paper didn't have any watermark in it, so that's good for me. I'm not going to have to fuss about it too much. And you guys will find maybe that your grid marks will be handy for you as well, so that you can grid off one part of your watercolor paper. Now, since we're going to use the majority of this piece of paper for our final drawing later this week, or our final ink drawing, don't cut off more than you need, but why don't you end up slicing off a little bit of this sheet. So go ahead and grab an X-Acto blade and a straight edge. And I'm just going to cut off enough for one strip. And I'll save the rest of that sheet for our next project. Then I'm going to make sure I use a dark enough pencil for you guys to see, but any pencil will do. Go ahead and lay in your division lines so that you have a clearly marked off 5-step value chart. This one should match the ones that you already have in your sketchbook, and so eventually we'll just tape that guy right in there. Now you may find that since especially these are going to be a little bit new material for you, and watercolor can be a little bit frustrating, you may end up needing to do more than one of these. You could also potentially work on the back if you want to keep trying it to get it right. But essentially what I'm going to be looking for is a nice even gradation that goes from dark to light in 5 steps. So get your watercolor kits. Watercolor paper. And then in your watercolor kit, you should have one brush. Now, I have a couple here just in case that you happen to have one of these things laying around. The one that's in your kit, that's sort of our big utility brush, and we'll end up probably using this for some glue later. This is not watercolor. If you take a look at the tip is likely it's already kind of glued closed. It's been sort of shipped in this way, but even when you break those pixels loose, or break those bristles loose from the glue that holds them together, the bristles are really coarse, and they're intended to be used for like thicker pigments like oil paints, acrylics, glue, and things. They work great for those, terrible for watercolor. Now, a true watercolor brush has very, very soft bristles. The one that I'm holding here is sort of a mop, right? This would be for laying down large areas of color. Now, this smaller brush is really going to be helpful for some of our detailed drawings, and this is the brush that you have in your kits. If you happen to have a larger mop for doing a wash, this would be a really handy brush, but since you guys don't have one in your kits, I'm just going to leave that aside. I'll do my entire demonstration with this detailing brush. It's also going to be important for you to have some water close by. Just tap water is fine. Scrap, a paper toweling, and you may find a palette to be really handy. Now, I really like using just a scrap of glass that I had laying around the studio. Anything water resistant would work. I like the glass palette because it's clear. I can put a piece of white paper underneath it to get a handle on my colors so that I know if I'm mixing accurately or not. And it also washes off really easily. where the plastics tend to kind of get gummed up and they end up being thrown away more often than not. So now I'm set up, and I like to sort of set my my watercolor station up in this arrangement where I've got my watercolors on top, my paper toweling in the middle, my water off to the side, so I can go from water to my paint tray to the paper toweling to my palette, and I'm not dripping over the top of my final piece in the process. I wouldn't want to have my painting in between the water and my paints. I'm going to end up kind of drip dropping all over my piece here. Controlling water is the hard part here, but once we get a sense for what the water can do and what it can't do, and where it's going to be drip dropping and where not, it's not quite as bad as it looks. I'm going to use the color blue in the palette here as my demonstration color. That way my value gradation matches the gradation on the handout. It's probably easiest to start with the lightest blue first. The first thing that I'll do is I'll wet my brush and bring a little bit of water to my palette. You'll find that watercolors get their name from the medium that activates it. They're suspended in water. These cakes are sort of a semi-moist, or they're not quite powdery dry, but they're not really liquidy either. They're sort of hard in the palette, but as soon as I bring a little bit of moisture to them and bring it to the palette, that paint becomes active. Now, it's surprising how very little paint you actually need to activate watercolor. This is why I said it might not be a bad idea to start with the lightest values first and work backwards toward dark, because I can always add more paint, but it's very hard to lift watercolors off the page. But just in case you feel like you have too much paint either in your brush or on your watercolor gradation here, this piece of paper toweling will be very handy in picking up that color. So let's start with a really nice light blue, and I'm going to lay that in with some sideways brush strokes as if I was laying in a graphite value gradation. So that's even darker than I initially imagined. It's a good thing that I laid that in, because now I basically know what my base tones are. Now I could just sort of lay that same tone down in each one of my successive squares and slowly build values by waiting about 10 minutes and then adding another layer, waiting 10 minutes, adding another layer. That's a really nice way to build value, is to just sort of build it as opacities. If this was sort of a 10 or 20% opacity, each successive opacity builds and they're additive. So if this is a 10 or 20%, this next one would be 20 to 40% opacity and would sort of arrive eventually at 100% opacity with the blue. Instead of waiting for the dry times, though, I'm going to slowly add just a little bit more blue successively in each square. And in that way, I should be gradually bringing my value gradation towards the dark blue. So that gradation is not bad. I think I could probably differentiate between a few of these. These two values look very, very similar, and these three values all look a little bit similar. So now that I've got my base values laid down, I could probably come back into this and work a little bit more value into them. So what I'll do is I'll start on the dark end and lay in a little bit more blue on top of my initial mix. And now this time, instead of working wet paint onto dry paper, I worked wet paint into wet paint. There was already kind of a pool of wet paint on that page, and so the watercolor behaves differently. It's very difficult to lift wet paint off of dry paper. But if there's a lot of moisture there, if there's sort of a pool of water, and I bring wet paint to that pool of water, it's much easier to fix that mistake by lifting it out. If I make a little mistake, added too much pigment too fast, I'll flood it with some fresh water and lift it off the page. And in that way, because I was able to add water quickly to the page and lift that out, that's a good example of how I might be able to do sort of an oops and lift that. So that was a little bit too much blue pigment too fast. I'm going to try to build up a little bit more of a density on this second value so that these two start to feel different. And then I need to build up a little bit more value here. So that these start to feel different. Now I need to differentiate between these two values. And one more pass on the darkest blue value. Now, if you're starting to have some issues with these values and they're not really feeling like this dark blue is getting dark enough, we do have one more option. We can actually create a tone of that blue by mixing in a very small amount of black paint. Now, be careful, because the black in this watercolor palette, it doesn't take much, and it's going to dramatically make the paints significantly darker and also a bit muddier. So I'm going to be really careful not to add too much black. I'm going to thin it out and lay that one on top to create a very thin layer of dark blue paint on the top. And that way I have a 5-step value gradation, and that'll prepare me for doing my final drawing. And eventually this will live on the same page as your value gradations.